Tonight we have a special program exploring the history of public housing in Boston. This is the first program in a 4-program series called Housing as History. The series has been about a year in the making and has benefited greatly from the support of a number of people and institutions. I would like to thank Mass Humanities and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard for their co-sponsorship of the series. We have also benefited from an amazing team of people who have shared their knowledge and connections with us. They are thanked in the printed programs, which I hope you'll look at. So I won't list them all individually now, but I would like to single out 2 people who are very important. The first is Larry Vale, who has been our project scholar. We certainly would not have been able to put this series together without his guidance and depth of knowledge. I would also like to thank Sarah Bertulli, the public programs coordinator at MHS. Sarah is very often at the front lines checking people in, and sometimes that obscures how involved she is in the planning, so I just want to acknowledge that this series would not have happened without her help. The history of public and affordable housing in Boston has been both a model for other cities across the country and a cautionary tale of what can go wrong. Considering the relative size of the city, Boston has had a large impact on affordable housing. This is a big story, and we really couldn't do justice to all of the nuances of it in a public program format, so we had to make some choices of what pieces to look at. We hope to explore other parts in the years to come. Tonight we will start this exploration. Before we get started, I want to give you a brief overview of what is to come in the other programs in the series and the format of the program tonight. The series will explore the history of public and affordable housing in Boston since the end of World War II. The first 3 programs will each look at the history of 2 sites in Boston. Tonight we'll look at Columbia Point and Commonwealth, also known as Fidelis Way. The next program will step away from public housing and look at 2 CDCs, Villa Victoria and Fenway CDC. And the third program will have a mixture looking at Orchard Gardens, formerly known as Orchard Park, and the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. The final program will give us a chance to look back at lessons learned and to look forward with the challenges facing affordable housing in Boston. And the speakers for the final series is an impressive group, so I would encourage you to look that up. The format for the program tonight will be a presentation by Lawrence Vale on the history of public housing in Boston, with particular attention to Columbia Point and Commonwealth projects and their redevelopment. Professor Vale is Associate Dean of the MIT School of Architecture and Planning and Ford Professor of Urban Design and Planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. He was a Rhodes Scholar and a Guggenheim Fellow and is the author or editor of 11 books examining urban design, housing, and planning. We'll have a conversation with Jane Roessner and Charlie Titus. Ms. Roessner is the author of A Decent Place to Live, From Columbia Point to Harbor Point, A Community History, which recounts the story of the transition of Columbia Point. Charlie Titus is the Vice Chancellor for Athletics, Recreation, Special Projects, and Programs at UMass Boston. He is also a former resident of Columbia Point, having moved to the brand new building with his mother and sister in 1954 at the age of 4 years old. After this, we'll have time for questions from the audience. And I would like to say that we will put out a microphone, and we ask you to come up and stand at the microphone and ask the question so that everybody can hear it and it can be recorded. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thanks so much to Gavin and Sarah and the rest of the Society for getting us launched on this effort. I'm thrilled to be here, and it's a subject that has intrigued me for my entire academic career, and I see already in this room people that I've known for a good deal of that at that time as well. So as Gavin said, to get us started, my plan is over the next 20 minutes or so to give you a kind of broad overview of public housing for families in Boston that really can trace the early enthusiasm, the dramatic decline that was about as dramatic as any place in the country, and at least an eventual partial recovery, with particular attention to 2 places, Columbia Point, now Harbor Point, and Fidelis Way, now officially Commonwealth Development in Brighton. Since we called this Housing as History, though, I want to take a quick journey back a little bit further, only 300 years or so, but I'll try and do it in 3 minutes or so. Because public housing is not the first time that the government grappled with how best to house the public. It's something that's been a problem, at least that challenge to house that part of the public that was struggling to afford market rate housing in a place like Boston. And I think there were 2 forms of government support that go way back into the 17th and 18th centuries that matter when it comes later to public housing. So North America's very first almshouse was established right here on Boston Common, just a short walk away from the wealthiest citizens in 1662, just in there. And it didn't last there very long, because once the peninsula started developing, the idea was, well, let's put it about as far away from people as it can get, which got it up to Barton's Point over there by 1800. Charles Bulfinch designed the building for it with women on one side, men on the other, and a chapel to make sure they were duly reformed in the middle. It didn't last long there, because South Boston was annexed and it got put to the city lands portion all the way out on this newly connected peninsula, where there was a house of industry, another term for almshouse, and a house of correction. So you've got the kind of prisons and others. And as if that wasn't far enough, by the 1840s, the almshouse was already moved further out, all the way to a monumental edifice on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. So if you look at sort of where the settled areas were and where the almshouse was, you can see just how it got increasingly far from settled areas of the city. A moment here to plug the new book, The Atlas of Boston History, that has been the wonderful project of Nancy Seychel's that's just out this month. Here's one of my favorite books that describes what it meant to house poor people when you didn't fully trust them. This is Civilization's Inferno, Studies in the Social Cellar by Benjamin Orange Flower, about Boston. While the wealthy are dancing on the top floor, there are men out of work in the Depression of 1893, when this book came out, that are considered the kind of worthy poor. Then there are widows and orphans, again worthy, and then there's the social cellar. And so a lot of the challenge was, where is the coping going to come up? Who do you cope with? Where do they come? So this whole coping mechanism tradition is one aspect of what the government was trying to do with housing the public. On the other hand, there's always been this tradition of supporting a particular kind of worthy working household. The evidence for the single family house as your sort of goal in life, or it says here, his castle home owning breeds real men. It's what puts man back in manhood. This is from 1922, the National Association of Real Estate Boards. Or here, does Brown own his home? No, he rents. Haven't you seen him scratch matches on the wallpaper? So there's this sense of this inferior moral being as the renter. And the owner and the push towards ownership as key to the whole thing. So you get things like the 19th century Homestead Act, land for the hardworking people moving out. You get in Boston the Homestead Commission. These are houses that were built for worthy working families in Lowell. And so when the Boston Housing Authority comes to the fore in 1935, I think it inherits from these long traditions of reward on the one hand and coping on the other. And I think it was mostly in the early years a kind of reward for the best families judged by the people admitting them. They wanted to make each project a highly selective collective. So Boston built public housing for families in two big waves. One before the Second World War, one just after. And then in 1954, stopped building public housing for families entirely, way earlier than many other cities. The dotted line, other things were housing for seniors. That was popular all the way through the 60s and 70s. Nationally, the same two spikes are there, but other parts of the country continued building more public housing through the 60s and 70s as well. So these pre-war housing that was done were all fairly close in, and they were remarkably away from the very few neighborhoods that had a non-white majority. These were the only places in the city in 1940 that had a majority non-white population. And so the housing that was in there was in these places and was largely slum clearance and largely housing white people in white neighborhoods. You got these kinds of places like this and this and this, cleared to build the greatly simplified modernist superblocks of the public housing. These three were all for whites. This was the smallest one for African Americans at Lenox Street in Roxbury. I did a study of who had lived in the neighborhoods that were cleared and who got in, and found that between 50 and 80% of the people that lived in those cleared neighborhoods applied, and between 2 and 12% actually got in. These were not the kinds of families that the Boston Housing Authority wanted to find. They had the wrong family composition. They had boarders. They had all sorts of incapacity to pay a rent. They were seen as a high risk. They were all kinds of families that were not desired. The cartoonist, as usual, says it best. The slum clearance bag of tool guys sees disease, dispiritedness, and delinquency, and the caption, "We hope you'll be gone with the slums." Boston congratulated itself in the annual report, which are these wonderful documents from the early 1940s, where after the first 8 were built, the fine print down here says, it beheld 8 clean, shining developments rising fresh to the sun, where once in dreary, dirt-filled dilapidation, slum buildings had shambled in contaminating hopelessness against a gray and somber sky. But public housing was going to fix the weather in Boston. People out of the dark alleys into the sunshine, and they didn't want to tell you that those kids are not those kids. Those kids weren't wanted. These kids were wanted. But it was celebrated. It was a place that you could have the 1945 annual report of the Boston Housing Authority treating public housing thrown in here and in here with the great national landmarks of the city, the great buildings of brick that marked the whole thing. And this wasn't meant with irony. This was meant with pride and celebration. The 2 places that we're focusing on tonight were among the 17 post-war family public housing developments. Columbia Point out here on the Point, and Commonwealth, or Fidelis Way, as it was known very soon after construction, out here in Brighton. And the ones that have dotted circles were sponsored by the state, because Massachusetts is one of the few places in the country that did its own public housing targeted to veterans, and the ones that are in solid circles were federally sponsored. So here's Commonwealth, Fidelis Way, opened in 1951 as integrated, which meant 97% white. But it was, unlike the pre-war ones, this was a place that was built on Brighton's last farm. It was open space with a lovely view of the whole city, and the new road, Fidelis Way, snaking its way through the development that is a combination of 6-story walk-ups and 3-story, 6-story elevator buildings and 3-story walk-ups that were there. It was convenient for people because it was right next to the Green Line. It was right near St. Elizabeth Hospital, and it had these great views across the city. And initially it was extremely well received. The very last of the public housing developments for families that was built in Boston was Columbia Point. Finished in 1954 with 1,504 apartments. It was the largest in all of New England. And racially integrated, although initially mostly white, but incredibly isolated out on the Point. 2 dumps next to it, a city-owned one and a private-owned one, that caused terrible problems for the neighbors. Eventually, or not too long after, there was a school, but it was an odd siting decision on the so-called calf pasture site. And increasingly, through the 1950s, there were these kinds of residents that could be these carefully screened, upwardly mobile, stable job, 2-parent households, no children out of wedlock, the right races in the right places, and all of the kinds of things that people were trying to control and guarantee. But by the end of the 50s and early 60s, more and more economically desperate tenants were there, and and you got an increasingly indifferent kind of management. The Boston Housing Authority is trying to figure out what to do with this. So after all of these decades at the beginning of kind of very selective work, they watched as the upwardly mobile white tenants took advantage of kinds of things that were only available to white people to get access to home ownership in other places, and faced up to the limits on black mobility in the city that were growing. At the same time as civil rights pressures were growing on the Boston Housing Authority to say, wait a minute, you can't have all the black people in Mission Hill Extension and the white people in Mission Hill across the street from one another. And organizations like CORE documented this. There were all sorts of pressures like that. There were legal lawsuits challenging the resistance to housing single-parent households. There were pressures by people displaced by highways and urban renewal to try and do this. So after much internal discussion, there's this 1965 moment where the BHA essentially says, we'll take whoever applies. There are a lot of double negatives in here, but not only its statutory responsibility, but also its moral public responsibility to accommodate low-income families in need of housing, limit its freedom to reject the potentially unacceptable tenant. It's a little clearer here. Families whose standards make them unacceptable are a responsibility of the community, and so far as their need for low-rent housing is concerned, of the authority. So just buried in that language about acceptability and who's acceptable and who decides who's acceptable is this kind of dilemma. Meanwhile, the Housing Authority itself is trying to undergo a transformation in governance. This was a moment in the late 60s and early 70s, in the early part of the more progressive side of Kevin White's mayoralty. The authority gained what three of its members called the tenant-oriented majority board. So you've got residents like Doris Bunting from Orchard Park. You've got a public housing tenant from South Boston who happened to be a Harvard undergrad at the time, John Connolly. And you got a labor leader, Julie Bernstein. And these people were really convinced that they could reform the place. But there was an executive director, the mayor's man. They could not control Dan Finn, and so the board fired him on television. And then the mayor retaliated by charging one of the tenants, Doris Bunte from Orchard Park, with trumped-up charges of misconduct in office, and the courts overturned his attempt to remove her. But it was a real battle over, whose voices mattered in these places. What was the role for residents? What was the role of the Housing Authority? And the Housing Authority, after that, lost the interest of Kevin White and went on to a downward spiral. The maintenance and management is plummeting. The occupancy at Columbia Point went from 1,500 households down to 350 between 1970 and 1979. And most of the rest of Boston's family public housing, like Fidelis Way, was between 30 and 50% vacant. This is like unheard of across the country. So something had to be done. The decline was slower and less extreme at Fidelis, perhaps, than at Columbia Point, but there were tensions with the neighborhood. There were terrible infrastructure and sewage problems. There were stories of literally frozen waterfalls in the stairwells during the 70s. So, black-oriented majority projects, white majority projects, all of them were failing pretty terribly. So what did they do? Something dramatic. The BHA is ordered into receivership by Judge Paul Garrity in 1979, and the 33-year-old Harvard Law School graduate Harry Spence is appointed receiver in 1980. He'd already run Cambridge and Somerville housing authorities, and here's what the Boston Globe tells us. They're asking, I think, several questions here. There's, can this man save public housing? There's, can this man save public housing? There is, can this man save public housing? There's, can this man save public housing? There's also, can this man save public housing? And there's, can this man save public housing? And there's, can this man save public housing? Not to mention the article about survivalists getting ready for the end that seems to be here. So let me try and parse what's really going on here, at least as I see it. It's really one question. Can this particular young, white, preppy, Harvard-educated individual man working in a racially polarized city, presiding over a series of female-dominated communities, manage to lead a competent, efficient process to save, recognizing all the moral baggage that this kind of reform entails, a public bureaucracy in the face of a market-driven private housing sector that distrusts government intervention? And does this fit with the Boston Globe's image of the triumphalist planner rising above the sordid built environments that make cities so ugly and thwart the opportunities of the poor to escape? Question mark. It's a lot of questions. And so this was the task that was being faced to people that wanted to redevelop these kinds of things. And so this is what happened as I moved to my concluding slides here. Spence inherits ideas about what to do at Columbia Point. He inherits ideas about what to do at Commonwealth. He inherits a few other kinds of things, and agrees and presides over at least some of the work at several different places. We'll have a chance in what follows to talk a bit about the transformation of mixed income housing that emerges at Harbor Point. What had been this isolated site of a dump is reimagined as this kind of new grid with a kind of pseudo-Commonwealth Avenue running down it that is actually measured to resemble that, and allays of trees. It's a kind of proto-new urbanist grid that's out here. The housing that had looked like this with no relationship to the water is now aligned to take advantage of the views. A few of the buildings are kept like they had been but rehabbed, and others were newly created. They were working very carefully. This is Corcoran, Mullins, and Jennison, and the architecture firms that work with them. They work very closely with the tenant organizations, and it's a story that is told rather fully in Jane Roessner's book, and we'll have a chance to hear more about that, A Decent Place to Live. And it yielded something that was kind of ahead of its time as a mixed income community. Not the first, but certainly something that was there. But it was only 400 units reserved for extremely low income people. What had been 1,500 had plummeted to 350, but when it comes back, they got enough to rehouse that number. But others would say, well, wait a minute. How could you lose 3/4 of the resource at a time of such scarcity? Meanwhile, 883 of the units were for market rate. And it's now Boston's choice waterfront apartment community. Your view is important to us. That's the point. So all of this, talk about what the point was before has been completely flipped. This is what rescued a place that probably would have gone down to zero, but also had critics from the other side that said, well, how could you lose this much of a resource, and how could you turn over the loveliest site on the eastern seaboard to something that is not serving public housing? So there are a lot of pressures like that were part of this, and certainly a lot of pressures that were battled for a pretty long period of time. But it's important to realize that Boston, under Spence, had another model. It was not just this model that got picked up by much of the country and said, oh, well, the model must be, if you're going to redevelop public housing, don't put more than a third for low-income people. We can do other kinds of mixes. Harbor Point, to its credit, was supposed to be a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 with a middle tier in it that didn't ever happen. But it was a different model that actually is the model that got followed mostly in Boston, other than Harbor Point. So I think Harbor Point is the kind of exception, and one that had acknowledged the range of community-driven and public housing resident-driven pressures to retain as much public housing as possible. So the model that happened in the Spence receivership in the other 3 places that were developed the Fidelis into Commonwealth development, the Franklin Field redevelopment in Dorchester, and the D Street West Broadway transformation in South Boston, said, we're going to do this, but we're going to keep it 100% public housing. We're just going to figure out some way to manage it better. We're going to figure out a way to do it. So this is the kind of investment that anticipated the scale of transformation and money that was available starting in the 1990s with the Hope 6 program. But here we are in the first half of the 1980s in Boston when you're pioneering these things. And so when they're thinking about what to do with other parts of the city, they looked at these models. I was actually part of the people that went around with the National Commission on Severely Distressed Public Housing and said, please look at Commonwealth. When they announced the program, they trooped everyone out to see Harbor Point instead. But I think it's an important kind of thing to see. So the architect, Steve Titus, that you'll hear from in the video, and landscape architect Kathy Schreiber, kept most of the buildings on this site. But they remade the landscape in important ways that created defensible space for residents and a kind of sense of territoriality for people, that they had, beyond their apartments, a sense of control over the outdoor space. So if you look closely, there's the old Fidelis Way looping up on the top one, and here you can sort of do the loop, but it's not the main thing anymore. It's a more direct path way through here. They took out one building right here and put a daycare center in, childcare being important, and community garden space right next to it. They took one other building out and put a community center in, as well as a management office. And then these two buildings were combined with a senior center in between that was immediately adjacent to the daycare center. And there are all sorts of things that were done to really think through what could happen, led remarkably by a very racially diverse group of residents. At the time that I looked at the place a few years after occupancy, it was 38% African American and 24% white and 20% Latinx and another substantial number of Asian households. It was about one of the most diverse communities in the city. And they put together a remarkable proposal, in part because they were given remarkably good guidelines from the Boston Housing Authority. The developers kit that was out there when they started, the quality of the staff, including Pam Goodman in the front row, was just remarkable behind this kind of thing. And so the residents worked with the developer, Corcoran. This is the brother of the Corcoran that was involved in Commonwealth. Like they're competing for the better metal model to do. I could imagine the dinner table kind of conversations. But they built at Commonwealth a 223-page management plan, and with residents that actually gave the residents the right to fire the private management company with 30 days notice. Can you say good lawyers? You know, I mean, this was a pretty remarkable thing, and of course, that just kept everybody on their toes, and it's been rebid and still keeps the same management 30 plus years later. And they did it while serving public housing residents rather than resorting to the income mixing. They did it by transforming the high-rise buildings into townhouses at the base that were walk-ups with private entrances and gardens, and transforming, as you can see over here, these buildings into, again, sort of triplex townhouses. It was a remarkable thing. So I think the real Boston style to public housing that has followed on this has been more on the Commonwealth side. I mean, more a willingness not to lose public housing, more of a willingness to say maybe we can have and manage well 100% public housing or nearly 100% public housing communities. And it resulted because there were a lot of community groups that had a backlash against urban renewal and highway displacement. There was this expectation for tenant-oriented thinking from the Housing Authority. Not that it was always smooth, but it was an expectation. The receivership showed the possibility of doing this well with 100% public housing. Nearby DSNI, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, that we'll talk about later in the series here, showed that local land use control could matter. The community development corporations that are developing, we're all part of this movement to say, well, you as residents have a say in how to do this. And then importantly, the Housing Authority has accepted a central role for empowered leaders. So I think overall the development of public housing, the redevelopment, following this encouraging start and devastating collapse, is that Boston's been more protective of the rights of low-income tenants than it's been the case in a lot of other cities that I've studied. So if you look at how these tenant groups, in collaboration with a substantially reformed public agency and supportive mayors, you can see that public housing regained enough political clout to remain an important part of the affordable housing provision in Boston. But I'd have to say as a concluding statement that Boston, as everywhere else, is falling way short on what is needed to house the city's residents in an affordable way. So, thank you.
You know, if I think about Columbia Point and Fidelis Way as two developments that were sort of growing at the same time, I think the major difference between what happened at Fidelis Way was the fact that it was in a neighborhood that was blue collar, middle class, if you will. It wasn't isolated. You could see downtown. You could hop on the Green Line and get to Fenway and downtown and Copley and that kind of stuff. Columbia Point was a lot different. There was no Green Line. The Red Line was there. You had to walk most of the time from Columbia Point to the Red Line station to get a train to go downtown. We did have great ocean views. And then, of course, we had the view of the dump. Now, one of the things that Larry did not talk about was the historic pump house. And the pump house was an international model. People came from all over the world to watch and to see how that pump house actually worked when they dumped the waste, run the waste in, and then innovation, send it right to the harbor. Of course, that doesn't work so well today. Columbia Point, for me, in the early days had some very fond memories, some very positive memories. When we first moved there, it was new. And so there were a lot of things that we liked about the kitchens and the bathrooms. There was green spaces that had little green iron fences around them. The neighbors really worked hard to make Columbia Point work. And there were some interesting neighbors. I lived on Monticello Ave, which was you cannot hear me? I'm sorry. I lived on Monticello Ave, which was right on the ocean. So behind my house was a large field, and then a fence, and then right to the ocean and the rocks. And we weren't supposed to, but we used to swim right off the rocks. So it was like having a beach in your backyard. The Columbia Point Center was operating at full force. There was a gentleman there that had a big influence on a lot of our lives from the time, I guess, we were about 8 to 14. His name was Stephen Ross. Steve was a Holocaust survivor. And he made his way to this country and decided that he wanted to give back, and the way he gave back was to get a degree in social work from BU, and then he came to Columbia Point to work with kids. I ended up becoming a basketball coach because of Steve. He formed a team in Columbia Point called the Columbia Point Tigers. Steve didn't know anything about basketball. And so he said to me, "You seem to be the best leader here, so you coach the team." And I like that. I mean, I like being in charge, so I sort of took on that challenge, and lo and behold, I ended up becoming a college basketball coach. But those are some of the fonder memories I have of the Point. I grew up in a single-parent household. My mother was from Georgia. She was the granddaughter of a slave. She was very proud. She dropped out of school in the 6th grade, but she was determined that her children would be educated. And so she made a lot of demands on us in terms of education. I went to the Dever School, which is still there in Columbia Point. It's now, unfortunately, a level 5 school, having some problems in receivership. But when I was at the Devil School, and I remember Miss Newell, Miss Higgins, and the teachers I had there, in Boston Public School, but they had standards and they made demands on us. I went from there to the Thomas and Hart School, middle school in South Boston, and things were starting to get a little touchy between the Irish communities and the African American communities and that part of the city. But I did my middle school in South Boston, at the Hart School in South Boston, and then, and I used to walk along the beach from Columbia Point up in the street and right into the Hart School and walk home every day. It was about a 30-minute walk. From there, I went to the William E. Russell, which is still there on Columbia Road, and about a 20-minute walk. And so we didn't have school. We weren't bused in those days. There was a bus that did go from Columbia Point to the Hart School, but I never rode it, except in the winter. I like walking along the beach to school. Most of the students that I remember in Columbia Point were fairly decent students. So we left the middle school, and some went to Latin school, some went to English high school. I went to Boston Tech, which was an exam school. Because of my mother and the teachers I had, school sort of came easy to me. So that was a blessing in my life, particularly when I started taking left turns as a teenager. 1964, I'd say 1962 to 63 was really the beginning of the changing of the point to me. So we were kids that I had grown up with from the age of 4 to the age of 11 or 12. White kids, black kids, we all played together, we grew up together, same buildings and stuff. Age 12, we started fighting against each other. And so the project started to split along racial lines. And it was an interesting phenomenon to have these kids who were your friends, who now were your sworn enemies, and you're just battling, not really knowing why. It really didn't make a whole lot of sense. We should have stayed friends and kept going. There were a number of activities that were enticing, that were not good activities. And my mother sort of saw me going to the left. And she kind of got scared. It was, there were 3 women living in my house, my sister, a cousin, and my mother. As most boys who hit 12 and 13 years old, I was feeling the testosterone and thought that I was becoming a man and knew what I was doing. So she made a clear decision. Columbia Point was not the place to stay. And she moved us up into Roxbury, Dorchester, Roxbury, and that was life-changing for me because the isolation was gone. There were more opportunities and more activities. So I began to participate at the Norfolk House in Roxbury. I began to participate at the Roxbury YMCA, the Roxbury Boys and Girls Club, which sort of took me back to the center and sort of got me back on track. And so I thank my mother for having that kind of foresight and concern for her children to get us into environments that were more healthy and that allowed us to develop and move in a different direction. I think that, I guess there's a lot I could say about Columbia Point. It was my formative years, or a good part of my formative years, and I actually think that the development could have worked if the housing authority had worked. The housing authority stopped taking care of the development. It's that simple. Their care for who lived there or who moved in there sort of dissipated. The maintenance just went away. There's no way that you can live in a development where you're basically on top of each other. The floor I lived on had 4 apartments. The walls were paper thin. And I heard in the film the woman talking about mopping the hallway floors. And I mean, when tenants, and we did that in the Point. And during my later days, we'd get out, my mother would make us mop the hallway floors because people were urinating in the hallways, and it just wasn't a way to live. So we're cleaning the hallway floors. There are no janitors. It's hard to have pride of place when you live in that kind of a situation. And one of the pictures that Larry had up, it talked about the gentleman scratching a match on the wallpaper. And I thought about that. And so I say to myself, is that someone who is just a degenerate? Or is it someone who just has no pride in this place? to me, there's a difference, right? And so that's part of, I think, a good part of what happened in the housing. Before I turn it over to Jane, I want to make one other point. I went back to Columbia Point. I was in college, and in the summer of 1970, I went back as a construction worker, building the campus of UMass Boston at Columbia Point. I worked for a troubleshooter, so my job was to take rubber seals and seal the foundation around the campus with rubber seals and glue. I did not know at the time about the issue with the gases that were coming up out of the ground because of projects there. And I did that job for 8 weeks, 6 weeks. The 7th week, the troubleshooter took me off the job, sent me to Cambridge where they were building a new building, Mount Auburn Hospital building, and said, you do the same thing. I want you to seal, put rubber seal on the frame of the building. So I looked at the frame of the building. He said, start up top. I have acrophobia. That was the end of my construction career. Nope. So I went to social services. But one of the things that was clear when I went back to Columbia Point and then back in '74 as a basketball coach at UMass Boston, the John F. Kennedy Library was coming. We knew, you could see how the point was changing, right? You could see the value of the land and how people began to look at it differently. The Boston Globe was there. When I lived out there, you had BC High, you had the projects. The Globe came later. There was a Finest supermarket that came later. And WHDH TV Studios was there where the bank is now. But that was pretty much it. The Columbia Point, or the Columbia Associates began to form and to talk about the future of the point and the peninsula. The Edward M. Kennedy Library came. The university came. I don't know if you've been on our campus recently, but we've got 4 new buildings, and it is just a magnificent waterfront campus. And so now you've got the University of Massachusetts, Boston. You've got the John F. Kennedy Library. You've got the Edward M. Kennedy Library. You've got a new development going in where the Boston Globe was. It's going to be spectacular. Is that my time up?
It's just an old clock.
We purchased the old Bayside Mall, which was another experiment. It really opened as a shopping mall to serve Columbia Point and the surrounding area. It failed badly. And then it was the Expo Center, but the university bought it. We now have a developer working on visioning what's going to happen there and how we can use that as a mixed-use development for community as well as a university. Those developers also were able to pick up the land that the bank's on. So that's going to be a part of the development of the point. The city of Boston has done a new visioning plan for Joe Moakley Park and Carson Beach that is just spectacular. That's what Columbia Point is about now, right? So it's a very high-rent district, and I think that if you really paid attention in the mid-'70s, you could see it. You could see it was going to come. You could see it was going to change. I don't think that, while I like Joe Corcoran and what Corcoran and Jittison did at Harbor Point for the most part, I wish that they had kept more low-income tenants there. But for the most part, I like what they did, and I think that they're great people. But their vision was not extraordinary. They saw what was going to happen at the point, and I think that they made a good decision out there and have been, in my opinion, a tremendous neighbor for the university and for the people in that part of the city.
Thank you. You've talked to lots of the things I was going to ask you about. Just to provide a little context, I wrote the book about Columbia Point in 2000, and I'm not an expert in housing, affordable housing at all. I'm an English major, but what I really wanted to do was listen to voices of people who lived at Columbia Point. It just seemed like the richest way to write the history to kind of capture the history of the place. And the voices are so amazing. Can you talk a little bit about, so you moved in, we've covered some of this before, but when, in 1954, when it was brand new, you were 4, and moved out when you were 10 years later, when you were 14. Can you talk about sort of, I'm also going to combine this with Larry's talking about where the almshouses were sited, kind of in isolated areas. What was that? Were there any positive aspects to the isolation of Columbia Point? You know, what were the strengths of the community when you were growing up there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, when you're between 4 years old, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you don't know you're isolated. I mean, Columbia Point was my life, my world. I mean, I thought that was it. I didn't know what was beyond that. Didn't know I was poor either. I mean, we had, I thought at that time, I thought we had a very rich life. I enjoyed families getting together and walking to Carson Beach for cookouts. In those days, we used to clam right on Carson Beach, so we go dig clams, and you walk on the sand, and you see them squared up, and you start digging, and you get your clams, and you get a bucket of clams, you take them home, clean them, boil them up, and eat them. I mean, those were good times for me. Those were good days for me, and for my sister, and for the young people who I was dealing with at that time, the ones that we were running with. I think that playing in the rocks, what we call the rocks between Columbia Point and Carson Beach, which actually was the remains of a prisoner of war camp that was built back in, I guess, the 40s. And as opposed to when they tore it down, they didn't take they just left the rocks there. They just demolished it and left it there. And so you could go out there and sort of go and make tunnels and walk through it. At the time, it was fun. We didn't think it was dangerous, but looking back on it, it probably was very dangerous. So yeah, I think, Jane, there were a lot of fond memories because we didn't know what we didn't know. I didn't feel at the time, I didn't really feel isolated. When we moved out of Columbia Point and I saw what a community, a different kind of community could really be, where I could go to the YMCA or the Norfolk House. I had choices where I could walk to a store or 2 or 3 different stores, where I could get to the barber shop without getting on a bus. That was a different lifestyle. And so, you know, you begin to think about it and you say, wow, Columbia Point was really different. We didn't have very much out there. So you saw and felt the isolation after you were out of it. But while I was in it, I didn't really feel it.
Also, I'm thinking in that 10 years, what was happening with racial friendships, just kind of on a basic level? How did things change?
Yeah, they did change, and I think some of it was the level of frustration that people felt living in a deteriorating environment. So the housing development was beginning to deteriorate, and you could feel it, and there was a lot of frustration in that. There was some outside agitation. I know that there was a gang in South Boston called the Saints, and they used to come to the projects and do a little agitating with the black kids, and then they'd leave, and we'd end up looking for anybody to fight, and we'd end up fighting white kids that we grew up with. There were white kids that we grew up with who sort of hung in South Boston, and sort of, my take is, got influenced by that negativity out of Southie and brought it back to the point. And so, and I also think that the city was splitting more along racial lines at the time. I don't think it was just isolated to Columbia Point. I think there was some things going on in the city. We certainly were fighting for better schools. De facto segregation was becoming a big, big issue and was building. There were people who were talking about how we handled the school issue in Boston, and that was before METCO, but the plans were being laid in those days for the METCO program and programs like that. So I think that some of the racial divide that was being created in Columbia Point sort of paralleled what was going on in the city of Boston. particularly with the school committee and the city council.
In your role at UMass, as originally director of athletics, I think, did you get a sense of what growing up at Harbor Point, how that was different from your growing up there as a kid?
Yeah, when I first went back, Harbor Point had not been developed, so it was the end of Columbia Point, and it made me very sad. I mean, when I walked over there, the street that I lived on, all of the buildings on that street just about were boarded up. The streets were bubbling up. It was just total neglect. And there were still some families living there, amazingly. And so one of the things that we did was we created a program in the gym for the youngsters, in the gym and the pool for the youngsters who lived in Columbia Point, so that they at least had some type of an outlet. Now, if you saw the university in those days, it was clear that the university was built in an unwelcoming way. All the buildings faced inward. And it was almost like, stay away, right? And the back of the university was to Harbor Point, or Columbia Point. There was a mentality on the campus that it was unsafe. They didn't want those kids on the campus. And it caused, in the early days, it did cause me some problems with the police. The police were not happy that we had a bunch of kids from Columbia Point coming into the gym. It pleased me. And they started doing some crazy things like putting trespassing warrants on the kids. So to battle that, we made a deal with the Walter Denny Youth Center where all of those kids would join the Walter Denny Youth Center. And as long as they had a card from Walter Denny, it was, they could use the gym and the pool with that card. So they became members of the athletic center, and that seemed to work out well. And if they got stopped by the police, they showed them their membership card, and that seemed to work out well. So we sort of wanted to embrace what was going on. There was a gentleman at Columbia Point that I had grown up with who still lived there, Bernie Sneed. We actually had a community outpost at Columbia Point. We had one in Savin Hill in those days, the university. So Bernie Sneed was the gentleman who worked for the university at Columbia Point and sort of coordinated, and he became a tremendous partner for us in developing programs that, number one, allowed youngsters to come and use the gym and the pool, got them into upward bound programs, and eventually into the university. And one of the things that we wanted to push is that the university, those youngsters should have felt like it was their university. It should have been their university. They should have had first crack at that university. And so we sort of pushed that effort, and I think it was somewhat successful. I've met a number of youngsters who, well, I shouldn't say a number, 12, who grew up and got an opportunity to get educated at UMass Boston because they grew up at Harbor Point.
So kind of the university had a divided kind of attitude towards Columbia Point, because I think I was teaching out there in late 70s at UMass, and I think there was a chain link fence across the end of Mount Vernon Street.
We tore it down.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
And did you, did people know you had grown up there?
Not initially, but they found out fairly quickly. Now, obviously, I had an affinity for the development and the youngsters who were there. I watched the transformation from Columbia Point to Harbor Point. And there were some interesting aspects. You know, when I went to, as I said, I used to live on Monticello Ave, which became Oyster Bay Road. So that was a kind of information transformation. I think that there were some mistakes made in reimagining Columbia Point. As I said, I think that more low-income people should have been allowed to stay or to move in there. They built a beautiful clubhouse with a swimming pool, but there was a rule, and I don't know if it's still in effect, but initially if you were under 16, you couldn't use the weight room or the pool. And I thought that was a terrible rule. Or at least if you're going to have that, you should have had something else for those young people under 16 to have as a space of their own where they could recreate and do things like lift weights or play basketball or run a pool. There were no inside the point, there are no real recreation areas for youngsters. And so behind the Dever School, next to St. Christopher's Church, there's basketball courts and a little softball field that's not regulation. And there have been 2 different iterations of us working with the kids at the point to fix that facility so that they had an outlet, somewhere to go and play basketball, somewhere to go and play field sports and that kind of thing. The problem with that is that we could not take on the responsibility for maintenance, nor did anybody else. So we fixed them up, but then they deteriorated again. Then we fixed them up a second time. We're kind of hoping, or at least I'm hoping, as the peninsula continues to develop with Bayside, with the Santander Bank property, and something's going to happen with St. Christopher's Church, I think, at some point, that we can develop some recreation spaces for the youngsters who live there, so that they have that as part of their growing opportunities at Harbor Point. You know, I want to tell you very quickly about an interesting partnership that we did with BC High. BC High and UMass Boston, neither one of us had a baseball field. And both of us had pretty good baseball teams. So some 15 years ago, Jimmy Carter, who was the athletic director at BC High, and this is how small Boston is. Jimmy was a mentor of mine. He was the first boss I had at 14 years old when I worked for the Neighborhood Youth Corps. And so we came back together on the peninsula. But we decided that we would combine our forces and build a baseball field. It took us a while to get it done. We created an LLC, of which UMass Boston and BCI is a part of, and we did a 99-year land lease deal with the land. And we created Monin Park, which is probably the premier high school college basketball facility in the Northeast, and the only, as far as we know, high school college shared basketball stadium in the country. So, you know, and there were we had to clear some hurdles. There were some folk in our legislature that said, you can't do that, it's state property, and they're a religious institution, it's separation of church and state, so we had to clear that hurdle. There were land issues we had to clear. But I think when you have a will to do something that's really good and people who are committed to it with a passion, those things can get done. So I'm optimistic about the future of that peninsula as it relates to the young people who will live there.
It's still developing as
It
a
is
community.
still- it is still
It's really
developing, yes.
something. I know we wanted to save time for questions, so Gavin.
Hi, my name's Carol Katz, Charlie. We were probably in the same classroom at the Dever School. I remember how things started to go downhill in around 63, 4.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Vale, you mentioned that there was a policy change in housing. And we all knew about that. And I think that a lot of families felt like my mom, that the authority had no more authority anymore to kick out people who were abusive to the places where they lived. And I think that's why there was a mass exodus after that. I hope that's one of the lessons that they learn, that you have to be able to keep people accountable, even in public housing. Do you think that was a lesson they learned? Like at Fidelis Way, are they doing that now?
I think one of the things that was so interesting to me about this management plan that they negotiated at Fidelis was that they really were talking about what is the community conduct that we want in this place so that it won't happen, it won't go down like it did before. And whether they were able to always enforce that or not, the fact that it was generated by residents for residents made for a lot of good trust. And I think, you know, that lesson,
That's
I don't
key.
know, you know, where it fully came from, but I'm struck by everybody that I interviewed back 20 plus 25 years ago when I was working on the book about the redevelopment in the 1980s, everybody who worked on the Fidelis Commonwealth story, basically, whether they were residents, whether they were social workers, whether they were lawyers, whether they were housing authority staff, whether they were architects or landscape architects, they said this was a high point of my career, my life, you know, because there was a level of mutual respect and trust building that was there that carried over into an approach towards management that was much more collaborative. And I think that that's a big challenge, and one that a lot of the communities that are being built now, especially mixed income communities, struggle to manage.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. My question is that one of the differentiating factors that was mentioned between Commonwealth and Columbia Point was access to light rail. And I'm wondering, in what ways would the experience of growing up in Columbia Point been different had the Red Line had an extension going down to the point? And do you think the area could benefit from one still?
Yeah, I think there may have been a small difference, but I don't know if it would have made a huge difference. Getting to the Red Line, 10, 15-minute walk. And there are buses now, shuttle buses that run back and forth from Harbor Point, UMass, JFK. So there's decent transportation to get up to the Red Line. You know, one of the points that, was it Carol? Mm-hmm. Carol's point and Larry's answer. I think that one of the lessons learned was that the residents have to hold each other accountable too. You know, it's not just the housing authority that has to do that. And in any neighborhood you live in, if there are expectations, acceptable standards and norms, and people know they'll be accountable, it changes that neighborhood for the better. So.
Thank you.
So I'm Pam Goodman, and I was involved in redevelopment, and I want to thank you for doing this. And I think one of the points that Larry made was really true. We spent years trying to work on developing trust between all the parties. The parties being the neighborhood, which was a great neighborhood, but they wanted us being poor people out of there. We had to work with St. Elizabeth's, we had to work with the Passionist Monastery, Brighton High, U.S. Public, the Marine Hospital. But what we focused on a lot was just developing trust between those of us at the BHA and the resident council, which was a very strong resident council. And it took a lot of work, but our actions showed that we really respected and trusted them. And as Larry said, we had incredibly detailed documents, but the resident leaders really did believe that residents needed to be held accountable. And that we were all working towards the same goal, which was creating and maintaining affordable housing. And people felt very strongly about not losing any affordable housing. And those of us at the BHA at the time agreed with that, and I still agree with that. I think that it's really about management and holding people accountable. And I'm incredibly proud that 30 years later, Fidel's Commonwealth is still really quality housing, serving very low-income people.
Hi, what a wonderful program. Right now in Boston, we are having a terrible time with affordable housing. All of the low and medium income people are being displaced for luxury housing, and our neighborhoods are being destroyed by it. So I work on the Fenway Civic Association board, and we make a point of talking about affordable housing all the time and seeing if there's something we can do about it. So
Here's an irony for you. Gentrification is changing racism in Boston and most urban areas in this country, right? South Boston is not the South Boston it was of school to seg days. It just isn't, right? Sometimes I get amazed. Now, during school to seg, I worked for the superintendent of schools, and I was a consultant. I was on those decoy buses that went up to get the kids out of South Boston High the day they couldn't get them out. That was one of the most scariest days of my life. I remember Luis being drug out of his car and beaten in South Boston. I remember going to the St. Patrick's Day parade as an 11-year-old with two of my friends and getting chased. The boys, the guys who were chasing us, the police didn't do anything to them. But they put us in a corner and stood out front so they couldn't get to us and waited for a squad car to take us back to the point, right? You couldn't walk in South Boston if you were black. Now I drive through South Boston, I see African Americans and Asians, and like everybody's just living there and walking around. It's just not the same. The neighborhood where I live, that I've lived since 1974, when I first moved there, all black. Now, if you want to live on that street, you better have $1 million to buy a house. I mean, it's ridiculous. My son, who is 33 years old, has a great job, cannot afford to live in a neighborhood he grew up in unless he comes and lives with his father. So, I mean, gentrification's having an impact. It's changing the neighborhoods. I don't think it's stopping racism, but it's certainly changing the neighborhoods.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I work at the Kennedy Library. My question, thank you. I have a question for Jane. In your opinion, do you think the Kennedy Library was a positive event for Columbia Point, or negative, or somewhere in between?
It was a good thing. You know, President Kennedy is an icon in this area of the country. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know how many young people really today understand who he really was for people in this area of the country. But I think it drew a different kind of attention to the peninsula when the library was put there. I think one of the challenges that we have when we talk about urban development and how we plan our future is how we really take advantage of that type of situation for all of our people and not just a few, right? That's the challenge. So I think it was a good thing. I'm not so sure that we did a good job in maximizing having it there just yet. There's still opportunity.
Thank you. My sense of the peninsula still is that there are discrete pieces and that they haven't fully figured out how to be a natural community because they didn't grow up as one.
That's right.
So it's a sort of accident or challenge of geography a lot.
Right. And there may be even, I mean, sometimes I wonder, and this may not be fair to put to you, but I wonder how JFK and EMK are getting along.
Hi. I thought there would be more attention to the contrast, or at least the supposed contrast, between the mixed income community and the community kept as a low income community. Now I say supposed because I live in Cambridge in an affordable development, and as we talk about how to get more affordable housing in the community, one of the ways that people are trying to shut it down is, oh, you know, you can't just put a bunch of low-income people together. You know, you've got to mix them into the community. And you know, I've been wondering, like, what's the problem? They don't lock us in. I get to go places like this. You know, I mean, I'm not being segregated or anything like that. So, can you say more about? I mean, was this just a way to just, you know, get this nice land on a point and claim that there was some benefit to having a mixed community? Or is there actually some sort of persuasive argument for doing this?
Jane can probably talk more about the circumstances of Columbia Point. It's probably one of the few public housing developments in Boston that I've not formally written much about. But I think this question of rationales for mixed income community is one of the most interesting points, in part because we have no good definition of what mixed income means. It can mean mixing all sorts of extremes of income, of very low income people and then very high end market rate, or it could mean varieties of low income people that may just have slightly different kinds of income. And we still have the same term for this. And then the people who have actually studied it, have debunked a lot of the assumptions, like this is going to be how low-income people will find role models. The studies that, sociologist after sociologist goes in and has a lot of trouble finding, how this is happening. And on like that. What people have found pretty consistently is that when you do these communities, they will attract more investment into that neighborhood. And
When you do which kind of community?
when you're not bringing an all low-income community in, and that this is a way of encouraging investment of new shops and restaurants and other kinds of things. And so people like that. But then you can have people priced out because those are not stores and restaurants that are for low-income people. So it's another form of gentrification that kind of comes in that way, where you're not directly told you can't afford your place, but you just can't afford anything around your neighborhood anymore. So there are a lot of different rationales that are being given, and I personally am a much bigger fan of income mixing with narrower mixes, and not losing well-located housing for low-income people in places like Boston and Cambridge and all over the country, and to me that's the big downside of something like the Harbor Point transformation. But I fully accept that people said, look, if you didn't do something dramatic like this, you would have not had any housing there, and so that's compelling. But would Boston do something like a 3/4 market rate or 2/3 market rate replacement for public housing? Never again. And that's a good thing.
During this time, and Pam worked extensively on Commonwealth. I worked extensively on Columbia Point. What Larry just said was the critical issue, which was the answer was tearing it all down. The mayor had shut down admissions to Columbia Point in the mid-'70s, and that was what the political establishment wanted to do. So we grabbed onto what was remaining because we needed to save something versus losing the entire point to demolition and the university or whatever other fantasy people had about what to do with this becoming more valuable piece of land. But right now, we are actually developing 100% low-income development in Old Colony, right on the waterfront, because Mayor Menino, his position was he wasn't going to lose one public housing unit, and you could gentrify by building new developments around Old Colony, and so there we'll end up in a couple more years having 800 units of fully newly developed public housing, 100% low-income.
Privately managed.
Last question. The best for last. Yes, thank you, panel, so very, very much for coming. Mr. Vale, to quote Harry Truman, President Truman used to always say, in order to know the future, study history, unquote. Mayor Curley pleaded with Franklin Roosevelt, do not build the projects. He said they are egg crates, crime beds, get us the future. Could you explain to us, if you can, how is there so many projects that were built so near to so many of our Catholic churches?
Oh, interesting. Well, there are a lot of really. I'd have to look at the exact details of things like that. But one of the things that was so interesting is that the Housing Authority was pretty careful about where these sites were going to be, and pretty careful about not tearing down churches and not building near liquor stores and things like that. They're actually mapping things like that.
Not in
But-
South Boston.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
no.
the-
I'm a resident.
Yeah, well, if you look at the West Broadway or D Street development, you have the parish was lost there, and the Lithuanian community was the one that complained most, because it was mostly the Lithuanians and Poles that lost everything except their church. There was one small parish church there, I know, in that part of Southie that went, but the overwhelming population that came in 1949 when that was built were Irish Catholic people, and the people that felt most depressed by that transformation were Lithuanians and Poles who felt like the housing authority had pushed people out, and they complained for 20, 30 years about that. So I think it probably differs in different parts of South Boston. But the only thing that was left when West Broadway was built were a school and a couple of churches, and the parishioners for the Lithuanian one were the ones who were moved out.
Well, they were all hurt. And like the speaker said too, Columbia Point, definitely, it was isolated, absolutely isolated. I work for utility. One of our utility men, climbing the pole, came down, he was stabbed and robbed. Our utility companies would not go in there without a police escort. It's very high crime. I'm not saying it reflects all the residents. It certainly did not. It was unfortunate. It shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. It's isolated. I'm glad it's a progressive day. I'm glad it's gated community day. It's a beautiful place today. It's gorgeous.
Thank you. May I just say that I think that you have been a wonderful, attentive, and engaged audience, and it's been my pleasure to be here this evening. I thank the Boston Society for having me, my colleagues for a great presentation tonight, in which I learned something. So that's always a good thing. Thank you so much.